Thank you for visiting my channel. Mental health as a result of incarcerations can be devastating and can last long after someone leaves prison. Incarceration can trigger and worsen symptoms of mental illness, and those effects can last long after someone leaves the prison gates. This is something I read from Katie Rosequant and Alexia Jones. We often talk about disturbingly high numbers of people with mental health disorders that are locked up in prisons and in jails, but less attention is paid to the ways in which incarceration itself perpetrates this problem by creating and worsening symptoms of mental illness. Research shows that while it varies from person to person, incarceration is linked to mood disorders, including major depressive disorders and bipolar disorder. I can relate to this because I have these issues today and go to treatment about 5 days a week to correct this issue. It's not very easy to undo the things that incarceration does to a person. I'm on parole today and out today about 1 year already. A little bit more than that, maybe. The carceral environment can be inherently damaging to mental health, and by removing people from the society and eliminating meaning and purpose from their lives, on top of the appalling conditions in common prisons and in jails such as overcrowding and solitary confinement, and the routine exposure to violence can further have negative effects on people. Researchers have even theorized that incarceration can lead to post-incarceration syndrome, a syndrome similar to PTSD, meaning that even after serving their official sentences, many people continue to suffer the mental effects. Incarceration itself is inherently harmful to people's health. Many of the defining features of incarceration are linked to negative mental health outcomes, including disconnection from the family, loss of autonomy, the boredom, and lack of purpose, unpredictability of surroundings. Professor Craig Hanley, an expert in psychological effects of imprisonment and prison isolation, explains, at the very least, prison is painful, and incarcerated persons often suffer long-term consequences as a result of this problem. Pain deprivation, extremely atypical patterns of norms, living and interacting with others can be a problem. Dr. Seymour L. Halleck has observed, the prison environment is almost diabolically conceived to force the offender to experience pangs of what many psychiatrists would describe as mental illness. The family disconnection part. By its very nature, incarceration separates people from their social networks and loved ones. In 2018, when researchers at the University of Georgia analyzed the relationships between prison conditions and mental health in 214 state prisons, they found that people incarcerated more than 50 miles from home were more likely to experience depression. This isn't surprising. Psychologists have long known that people with social support and positive family relationships tend to have better psychological well-being. This was especially difficult for me because I was always 5 to 8 hours away, and that made visits impossible for me. Similarly, a 2015 review of research on impact of prisons on mental health, separation from family and friends, emerged as a major stressor for incarcerated people. It was also associated with psychological distress. In fact, many people describe this as a separation as the most challenging aspect of their incarceration. Goumeny and Dickinson, who authored this review, found that even when incarcerated people receive visits from family members, the environment makes it difficult for them to connect with each other in correctional facilities because they're built around the goal of security. And these regulations and security measures inevitably impact the relationships between prisoners and their family and even their children. Separation from children can especially be distressing for incarcerated women. As one 1998 article in Behavioral Science and the Law noted, separation from children is one of the most stressful conditions of incarceration for women, and is associated with feelings of guilt, anxiety, and fear of losing mother-child attachment. A 2005 study found that most mothers described an intense feeling of guilt, distress, depression, and one mother in that study explained her feelings. All I could do was cry. It was horrible being away from your kids, especially when they're the only people who care about you. Another said, I was very hurt and depressed, crying constantly, and worried. The study noted that 6% of the mothers interviewed described themselves as suicidal early in their incarceration, as the separation from their children continued. 22% continued to focus intensely on their distress, loss of autonomy, and lack of purpose, the common feelings. Incarcerated people have virtually no control over their day-to-day lives, including when they wake up, what they eat, what their jobs are, and when they have access to recreation. This can lead to feelings of dependence and helplessness. The three main studies included in Gumney and Dickinson's review all included that this loss of autonomy harms mental health. Once again, this makes sense. We know people feel better and have better mental health outcomes when they have control over their surroundings. Similarly, incarceration is also characterized by boredom, monotony, and lack of stimulation. Many incarcerated people have limited access to education, job training, and other programs that can fill their time and become a meaningful part of their life. In 2003, a study of incarcerated people in England, participants reported a lack of activity and mental stimulation leads to extreme stress, leads to anger and frustration, and some reported using unhealthy coping mechanisms to manage boredom, including substance abuse. The 2018 University of Georgia study mentioned earlier also I found that people in prisons with limited access to work assignments experience high levels of depression. Once again, this fits the psychological research that shows meaninglessness and a lack of purpose can lead to symptoms of anxiety, depression, and hopelessness. I also have issues with this. I suffer from this all the time. Being able to connect with family members are difficult as a consequence of all of this. These feelings of anxiety and depression can be most increased and worsened by the unpredictable nature of the carceral environment, as behavioral science in the law article mentioned above explains. There are numerous rules in prisons and jails that do not exist in the free world, many of which are ambiguous and only enforced erratically. The authors note that institutional rules are enforced selectively depending on factors such as inmate-staff relationships, staff members' mood, the severity of the violation, and the convenience of the rule enforcement. This lack of clarity and predictability can contribute to feelings of uncertainty and stress. Cruel conditions make negative environments worse. Even relatively humane prisons or jails can contribute to negative mental health outcomes for the reasons outlined above. But the reality is that poor conditions in prisons and the jails cause significant and additional suffering and trauma. As the World Health Organization explains, there are factors in many prisons that have negative effects on mental health, including overcrowding, various forms of violence, enforced solitude, or conversely, lack of privacy, lack of meaningful activity, isolation from social networks, insecurity about future prospects, work relationships, and etc., and inadequate health services, especially mental health services. This list of mentally damaging conditions accurately describes most U.S. jails and prisons. Overcrowding and punitiveness. Many jails and prisons throughout the country are overcrowded, and which makes this inherently negative carceral environment even worse. Overcrowding often means more time in the cell, less privacy, less access to mental and physical health care, and fewer opportunities to participate in the program and work assignments. Correctional administrators may respond to overcrowding by foregoing screening and monitoring of vulnerable people. A 2005 study that found that overcrowding is highly correlated with prison suicide. 2008 study 18 found that Georgia similarly found that overcrowding and punitiveness are correlated with depression and hostility. The researchers noted that punitive environments likely set inmates on edge, making them overly hostile and even depressed. Solitary confinement. Being put in solitary confinement, which is a common practice in many prisons and jails, especially harmful to mental health. As we discussed before, the stress caused by spending time in solitary confinement can lead to permanent changes to people's brains and their personalities. Depriving humans who are naturally social beings of the ability to interact with others can cause social pain, which affects the brain in the same way as physical pain. A 2000 study found that people were significantly more likely to develop psychiatric disorders while in solitary confinement than while housed in non-solitary units. Trauma from experiencing and witnessing violence can be tough too. Prisons and jails are extremely violent places for people often experience traumatic and verbal and physical assaults and dehumanization at the hands of correctional officers. And the various stressors in a carceral environment also increase the chances of violence between incarcerated people. Researchers in 2009 found that experienced violence during incarceration was significantly related to aggressive and antisocial behaviors and tendencies as well as emotional distress. In fact, even witnessing violence behind bars can be traumatizing. As we have discussed previously, exposure to violence in prisons and jails can greatly increase existing mental health disorders or even lead to the development of post-traumatic stress symptoms like anxiety, depression, avoidance, hypersensitivity, hypervigilance, suicidality, flashbacks, and difficult with emotional regulation. The lasting effects are some researchers suggest that the trauma people experience behind bars can lead to post-incarceration syndrome, a syndrome that shares characteristics with PTSD. A 2013 study of 25 released lifers found that participants experienced a specific cluster of mental health symptoms, including institutionalized personality traits like distrusting others, difficulty maintaining relationships, and problem-making decisions, social sensory disorientations, issues with spatial reasoning, and difficulty with social interactions, and social and temporal alienations, the feelings of belonging in social settings. Similarly, a 2000 literature review found that incarcerated people experience high rates of potentially traumatic events, often shortened to PTEs. To review social revealed that experiencing PTEs behind bars was strongly correlated with rates of PTSD upon release. We often think of incarceration as something people live through and from which they can ultimately be released. But the reality is that time spent in prisons and jails can create a host of collateral consequences that haunt individuals even after release. As the research shows, incarceration can trigger and worsen symptoms of mental illness, and those effects can last long after someone leaves the gates of prison. More critical statistics are made already on the mental health in incarceration. There's research that exists about mental health incarceration in the Comprehensive Research Library, including a handy list of some of the most essential facts. Most you can browse by the Mental Health Research Library. A 2019 report shows that jails are more likely to have serious mental health. People have more mental health needs. In 2019 report, Arrest Release Reprieve breaks down demographics of who goes to jail every year, showing that people who go to jail are more than twice as likely to have serious mental illness and more than 4 times as likely to have a substance use disorder. Now, I'll get into the Less is More Act and tie everything together. It's important because reincarceration can cause serious side effects. New York imprisons more people for non-criminal technical violations than for parole, like missing an appointment with the parole officer, or late curfew, or testing positive for alcohol and other drugs, than any state in the country. Less is More Community Supervision Revocation Reform Act, S. 1144, or Benjamin A. 5576 Forest Assembly Bill, developed by people on parole, people currently incarcerated, family members, the Casale Center, Unchained, Justice Lab, New York City Legal Aid. The bill is sponsored by New York State Senator Brian Benjamin and Farrah Forrest of the Assembly. The provisions to this bill are restricting the use of incarceration for technical violations. These are non-criminal violations that are not against the law. Incarcerations would be eliminated as a sanction for these technical violations. Certain technical violations could still result in jail time, but it would be capped at a maximum of 30 days, which would get people's attention and make them have accountability just the same. Right now, it is at the discretion of the parole judge and can range from 90 days to 5 years. It's up to them. Of the people on parole whom New York sent back to prison in 2016, over 6,300 or 65% were reincarcerated for technical non-criminal parole violations. Nearly 1/3 of the new admissions to state prisons are due to people reincarcerated for technical violations of parole. 86% of the people on parole who were reincarcerated were not convicted of a new crime. The racial disparity is stark. Black people are incarcerated in New York jails and prisons for technical parole violations at more than 12 times the rate of white people. I said 12 times that. How many incarceration connects with poverty? How does that connect? First, it is important to understand the connection between poverty and criminal justice system. Decades of research show that people in prison tend to have faced other serious challenges before their incarceration. For one, mental health issues are common among people in prison, who are also less likely to have a high school education than the general population and more likely to come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Prisons generally only exacerbate these problems, make them worse. For example, research shows that time in prison can cut annual earnings roughly in half. There are many potential explanations for this, such as pervasive unemployment. According to some estimates, around 27% of formerly incarcerated people are unemployed. By comparison, The civilian unemployment rate hit 10% in the immediate aftermath of the Great Depression, or Great Recession, and briefly peaked near 15% during the first wave of COVID-19. Truly transforming our criminal justice system means long-term thinking. We need policies that address these endemic problems and expand economic opportunity for all people with a criminal record. Indeed, poverty and unemployment experience after prison may even lead to some people going back to crime. Through the connection between recidivism and unemployment is very complicated. Lots of reforms need to take place. One of the things that I'm working on is parole reform in the Less is More Act. Parole revocation reform. The first is the Less is More Act S 1144 A.5576, which would prevent people from being sent to jail and ultimately imprisoned for the slightest deviations from their conditions of parole. These reincarcerations interrupt the already difficult process of reentry, upending the lives of people on parole and their families, and likely contributing to the long-term economic consequences of the time in prison, like the mental health issues I just spoke about. Currently, parole operates on a hair trigger that, such as violating even a minor or technical condition of release, can land somebody in jail for up to 105 days and ultimately back to prison for up to 5. Common parole conditions include maintaining regular meetings of parole officer. Others may entail submitting to drug and alcohol tests and abiding by curfew and residency requirements. Functionally, this means that people on parole can be and have been summarily jailed and returned to prison for something as minor as failing a drug test. Incarceration for technical violations is also surprisingly common. Nearly 7,500 people were re-imprisoned for these violations in 2018. According to the Columbia Justice Lab, reincarceration in jails and prisons costs the state roughly $680 million. That money could be used for education and treatment of mental health, substance abuse disorders, and all kinds of other things that we go through in society. The Less is More addresses these problems by limiting the circumstances in which somebody can be sent back to prison for a technical parole violation. Under this bill, people accused of technical violations cannot, in most cases, be detained in jail while awaiting parole revocation hearing. Further, when detention is authorized, hearings would have to be held promptly to minimize the time in jail, and people determined to have committed a technical violation would not, in most cases, be returned to prison. Instead, they would face an escalating list of sanctions, with re-imprisonment authorized for people who only repeatedly break parole conditions. Only people repeatedly doing that. I think that in and out of prisons cause mental illness. In my experience, living in prison can be very stressful, cause isolation, and a lot of health problems that I have. And it costed the state billions in treating them. As always, I want to thank you for coming to my channel on time to ask you for your comments and suggestions. Also, if you subscribe, you will get all my updates, and I look forward to hearing from you. Also, if you could hit that like and the subscribe button, I'd be very grateful. Till the next time, have a nice day.